You're the type of player that will greed their components for the items exactly shown on the tier list that you're following and slam one of those items immediately as soon as you can make it. If so, you've probably run into issues where you have too many backline items by the end of the game and not enough tank items. But hey, that's TFT, right? Component drops are totally random, so there's probably nothing you can do about it, right? Well, not quite. After all, the top players don't run into this issue quite as much. But why? Hello Tactician, Professor Blab here to teach you to be a better gamer, and today's topic is going to be item economy. Now you've probably heard of the term econ before as it applies to gold. So what does item economy mean? Classic econ management is about finding a balance between saving gold for interest and using that gold to build a strong board. Item economy is similar in that you're finding a balance between the best possible version of a single unit versus making items that are the best for your entire board and team as a whole. And best way to show that is with a very quick and simple example. Suppose you have 4 components: glove, sword, and chain, and you want to make 2 item slams. Well, your tier list, if you're playing AD, probably has Infinity Edge as a best in slot item for your backline AD carry, so you should probably just make that, right? Well, then you'd be left with a sword and a chain, and chances are you don't really want to make Edge of Night in the comp you're playing, so you'll need to sit on these components for a long time and wait for either carousel or the next PvE round. But if you haven't actually slammed any tank items at all right now, you'll have a pretty weak stage if you just sit on these components. Instead, you should consider making, say, a Deathblade and a Steadfast Heart with these items. While your carry will be a little bit weaker with a less optimal item, your board overall will be stronger because your frontline now has an additional item slam. And this is the basic idea behind item economy. Most players know that it's good to chase the BIS setups with carry and that tank items are flexible, but they go a little bit too far with this and completely neglect frontline altogether, chasing those BIS setups. Instead, you should think about what item to make that makes your entire board stronger. After all, if you have no frontline, then your 3 item perfect backline carry isn't going to live long enough to actually output damage. Another thing that players tend to neglect are the utility items like Anti-Heal and Sunder or Shred for the endgame boards. This is often also because they over-prioritize the best items for the carry and didn't leave components to make one of these important debuffs. For example, if you happen to have a bow and a sword, you might be tempted to make Giant Slayer for your carry, especially if it's considered a best item. But even though it makes your board stronger now, it might be better to save that bow to either become Red Buff or Last Whisper to have one of those effects, as the sword can really be paired with any other component to make a different damage item. This is a situation where even though Giant Slayer would make your board stronger now, it might be better to save that component as it makes important utility items later that makes your final endgame board much better. Now, obviously, we can go on forever with examples, but each situation and game is different. So how to actually use these ideas to help you manage your items better? Well, there's 3 key principles to keep in mind. Number 1 is knowing the priority items for the comp you're playing for your carries. While the third item for a unit is often pretty flexible, a lot of the time your carries will have 1 to 2 non-negotiable items. Understanding what these are helps you know which components you need to save. Using an example from set 16, 80 marksmen like Yunara really depend on Krakens and are much less effective without it. This means at the start of the game, you should really think twice before using any cloaks on a tank item, as you'll want to save that cloak for your first Kraken. Another example are tiers in AP-based comps. Often, your units want both a mana item as well as a void staff, making tiers a premium backline item, which means you should think twice before slamming something like a Spirit Visage or Protector's Vow for your frontline, even though these are great tank items to make early on. Now, unfortunately, most of the tier lists out there won't show you item priorities for each unit, and they'll just simply list 3 items. So how do you tell what they are? Well, it's going to have to come down to a bit of experience, but one way you can self-serve this is looking up stats yourself. So what you can do using one of the many data explorers out there is look up a unit and their itemization and look at this place change column. A larger negative number means better placements, which means you should prioritize that item more. So using set 16's Yunara example, most players know that Kraken, Infinity Edge, and Rageblade are her best in slot items, but it might surprise you to find that out of these 3, Rageblade is the least required. What this means is with that first bow, it's much more important usually to prioritize that Kraken than it is that first Rageblade. Just keep in mind that you should really filter out anything that has too small of a sample size, as that's usually not going to be reliable to go off of. Tip number 2 is to know your item recipes. Now this one seems obvious, but in order to leverage item economy properly, you need to know by heart all your component recipes and also which components are better at making what type of items. Let's take a look at each component individually, starting with Vest. This makes 6 tank items and 2 melee fighter items, making this one of the best components to have when you need to make a tank item, but pretty poor when you need a backline carry item. And while you may think of Cloak as a similar counterpart tank component, it's actually much worse at making tank items, making only 4, and 2 of which Dragon's Claw and Even Shroud are situational and not for every single comp or lobby. Belt is in a similar situation. While a lot of the time you think of it like a tank component, this only makes 4 tank items while the rest are carry items. But one thing to know about Belt is that it builds into several good utility items, making a great component to hold onto. Morello's Sunfire for burn, and Even Shroud if you do happen to still need Sunder. Bow is of course a backline all-star, making 7 great items and 1 frontline item for Titans, but no tank items at all. Similar to Belt, it's also a great component to hold for utility effects being used to make both Void Staff and Last Whisper, whether you're AD or AP, as well as Red Buff if you're missing burn. Rod, as you might expect, is pretty straightforward, used to make a bunch of backline AP items. If you happen to be playing an AD comp, you should be keeping in mind some useful ways you can utilize Rod for things like Crown Guard for frontline and Morellos for burn. Gunblade and Rageblade are also fine items to equip on your AD carries. And similarly, Sword of course makes a bunch of AD items, including some of the frontline bruiser items like Edge of Night, Bloodthirster, and Stacks. Just like Bow, Sword is a component that cannot make a true tank item. Of course, if you do need more frontline, you can sometimes consider Stacks for your frontline tank, just to utilize its shield effect, so don't forget that use. And if you're playing an AP comp, swords are great to make items like Giant Slayer, Gunblade, or Shojin, so make sure you save components for one of those. Tier makes all of our mana items along with some tank items and AP backline items. Overall, quite a flexible component to hold on to, and you can find uses for it in almost any comp. And finally, Glove is an important crit item, making Infinity Edge and Dual Gauntlet along with other great damage items. Like Rod, the one defensive item you can make combined with Chain is Steadfast Heart. But another use for this component is slamming with the second one to make Thieves Glove as a generically good item if you end up with too many gloves. If you've heard your favorite streamer talking about the concept of an open component, that's essentially what we're talking about here. Even though component drops are random, depending on the type of item you want to make, some components are better to play around than others. Let's take a look at one more quick example. Let's say you're playing an AD comp and interested in making a tank item and you have Chain, and Rod. Well, if you scout the lobby, you might find that, hey, there's a fair amount of AD players in the lobby as well, so maybe I should make a Thorn Plate as the best quality tank item for my board right now. Well, that's true. Then you'll be left playing around an open Rod, which for an AD comp is going to be a lot harder to utilize. A better approach here might be to actually slam a Crown Guard. Even though it may be a lower quality tank item right now, playing around an open Chain means you're much more likely to get a second good tank item later than an open Rod. And the final tip is to always make sure to balance frontline and backline items. One common mistake is to over-prioritize carry items, especially taking things off the carousel, and not end up making tank items until much later in the game. Most comps want to end up with 1 fully itemized tank and 2 carries, but typically you should balance this by aiming for a 3-item tank and 3-item carry before starting to itemize your second carry. If you neglect frontline items, you'll find you'll be quite weak, particularly in stage 3. This is exactly what item economy is about, finding the balance between the power of individual units and the power of your entire board. Correctly making these decisions in a game is really hard, but this is the perfect opportunity to review some older games. If you end up with a game where by the end you feel like you couldn't get enough tank items, look back through your play and see if you could have maybe slammed a different item or picked a different component off a carousel that would have led to a better item balance. Of course, you can't beat all RNG, and sometimes you are just going to get dropped a bunch of swords in your AP comp and have to take a bot fall. But hopefully, if you start understanding item economy better, that's going to feel like an exception rather than the norm. But that's a wrap on today's lesson. Hope you learned something valuable, and I'll see you next time. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a comment and like below, and subscribe to know when the next lesson is available. But until next time, class dismissed.